And welcome back to our next edition of the CBB Review Studio podcast. I am Dan Siegel, joined today by my co-host Ben Anderson, and we are back with another part of our multi-part series where we will be talking about transfer portal winners and losers. Today we're talking the ACC, but before we begin, just wanted to remind all of you to subscribe if you have found our channel and like the content that you have found. Be sure to like this video. It just helps us out and costs nothing on your end. So really appreciate that. Let's get started. We are going to do, like I said, ACC transfer portal winners and losers. I'm going to throw it to you, Ben, first, and we'll start with the losers, then we'll get into the winners. So who is one of the, I think we each had three on our list. So ACC transfer portal losers of the three on your list.
Sure. I'll start off with the clearest one, in my opinion, at least, and that is Florida State. They really struggled last year. Leonard Hamilton has had a tough year, a tough last couple years with the program in Tallahassee, and they lose a ton this year. They lose Cameron Fletcher, they lose Jalen Morley, Cameron Cohen, Baba Miller. These names might not be necessarily household names in the game of college basketball, but those were big time performers for a not very good Florida State team. So they lost 7 transfers in total and only bring in 3. 0 are high major, and 2 of them aren't actually even ranked by 247 Sports. So you have Justin Thomas coming in from UTSA, Boston Holt from South Dakota, and then Jerry Dang from Hampton. It just isn't a very inspiring class that he brought in, and I'm really just kind of worried about how good this team is actually going to be. They bring back Jameer Watkins, who is in the portal, and then he was in the draft for a little bit, ultimately withdrew, so that's a big pickup for them. But outside of Watkins and a couple other players, not a ton to be excited about for the Seminoles.
I had Florida State not as my loser, but definitely in the honorable mentions for my losers. I just think when you're bad, losing your core is maybe not the end of the world, but they brought in like nobody that I could get excited about to any capacity, in my opinion. So definitely a solid pick there. For one of my losers, I'm going to stay in the state, the Sunshine State, and I'm going to go with Miami, which I think we talked about this pre-pod. You said it was a little bit interesting, but I think you lose Wooga Poplar to Villanova. That's a big addition for them, but a big loss for Miami. You lose Norchad Omier. He's off to Baylor. You lose 5 more, but those are really the 2 big ones right there, and those are really 2 guys that would have made up a core of returners for Miami, who does return Nigel Pack and Matthew Cleveland. So they could have ran it back, and I know they really fell off towards the end of last season. Down the stretch, they lost a lot of games. But if you were able to return 3 or all 4 of those guys, I think there's a good chance I could say Miami's going to run it back and have success. And a lot of people are high on Miami bouncing back, but in my opinion, the incoming group that they did bring in is unimpressive. I was not a big fan of Lynn Kidd at Virginia Tech. Brandon Johnson at ECU, pretty solid, put up some good numbers. I don't think he's a game changer there. So that group in general is just not moving me. I'm having Miami as one of my losers.
I think that's fair. I didn't have the Hurricanes on my list myself, but I do think that the concerns about the losses in particular are really prevalent. I just thought that the additions of Kidd, Johnson, and then Jalen Blackman coming in as well were just enough to keep him off my losers list.
Do you want to give me another one of your losers, though?
Yeah, let's go ahead and go up to the state of Virginia, where I had Virginia Tech as one of my losers. I do remember back, I don't know if you remember this, Dan, but back in the early days of the portal opening, there was mass hysteria outside of in Blacksburg right there. They just lost pretty much everyone, it felt like. Most notably, they lost Sean Padula, their starting point guard for the past couple of years. They lost Tyler Nickel, who had just come in. Recently, they had lost MJ Collins and then Lynn Kidd, obviously, as we mentioned before. They do bring in some interesting pieces, most notably Hysier Miller and Jaden Shutt. Hysier Miller is from Temple, and then Jaden Shutt is from Duke. So there are some players that they brought in I thought were interesting, but the losses are just so heavy in Blacksburg that I had to find a space for them on my list.
I had Virginia Tech on my list as well of losers. I think their roster next year is it's looking very bleak. It's looking like in a ACC that's adding some teams, and some teams are going to get out of the basement, one of which I'm sure we'll mention later in this podcast. In a conference like that, it seems like they're just they're falling behind. I think they're pretty much looking like a bottom third roster. I mean, if you look at them, Couture graduated. You wanted Padula and Lynn Kidd to pick up the slack, but they're gone, and then you lose a core of young pieces in Nickel, Collins, and Rice. Like that's just not going to cut it. So that's two of my losers right there. We mentioned Miami, we mentioned Virginia Tech. I also want to talk about Stanford, who is coming into the ACC from the West Coast, from the Pac-12, which is no longer a thing, and they lose four of their top five leading scorers. They are all out. Plus Andre Stojkovic, who had a very good freshman season. And they don't really bring in ACC level talent, or at least they don't bring in high level ACC talent to compensate for that. And I get it. It's difficult for a program like Stanford, who is not performing at a very high level. Now you're playing in the ACC on the West Coast, so you're traveling for a lot of games, many, many miles. I get it. It's hard to keep your talent, but you would expect them to really bring in a bulk of exciting pieces to compensate, or at least you would want that to happen. And they just simply didn't. So Stanford is my third loser.
Yeah, the losses are pretty heavy, especially in terms of Kanan Carlisle and Stojakovic, who was just a freshman, but showed definitely a lot of potential, as you mentioned. I think it was big for them to get Maxime Reynaud back from the portal. He withdrew and came back to play another year in Palo Alto, but I kept them off the list, my losers list, for the exact reason that you were skeptical of it, is because it is Stanford. It's very difficult, and you look in their past transfer history, they really don't have any success at all. So to bring at least a couple of players who have some experience, Jalen Blake's played at Duke. He had minutes at Duke. He wasn't a starter or anything, but he's played on the ACC floor before. Oziah Sellers had some minutes at USC as well, and then of course Chisholm Opara coming in from Harvard. There was some production there, albeit at a lower level. I think they were doing about as good as they could have done in Stanford, especially for a first-year coach in Stanford in Kyle Smith. So I think there is some reason to be skeptical of how good this class is, but given the constraints that they have, I think they did a pretty decent job overall. And then I'll move on to my final loser, and this was sort of a tough one for me to pick out as well, but I went ahead and went with Notre Dame. And you might be thinking this is a bit of an odd pick because they only had really one major transfer out in Kerry Booth, but they only had one transfer in as well, as in Matt Alaco. They had two, but one main one in Matt Alaco from Princeton. And you saw some success with Princeton transfers last year when Ryan Langborg went to Northwestern and put up some pretty big numbers. So I think Alaka will have production when he gets to South Bend, but this was a bad team. And that's what I'm worried about. And you don't really see them adding much of anything. I am a believer in players like Marcus Burton and Brandon Shrewsbury and a couple of others that have shown some promise. But it is a young team, and I just don't see this year's cycle as getting them a lot better in the immediate 24-25 season.
All right. Yeah, that's fair. I actually did not even have Notre Dame as one of my two honorable mention losers, but that's a completely fair point. I think you would have expected more, and especially you gave year one a real excuse for Shrewsbury, but like now going into year two, you want more talent. You want more results, and it's not looking like that's necessarily going to be the case. Here's an interesting one I want to mention because I don't think this is on your winners list, but maybe Duke, because their roster is looking great, right? But there's one key thing that I think is missing from that roster, and that is a true point guard. Because I think the guys that they're bringing in, the freshmen that they're bringing in, they're all like, lengthier guys. Some of them could handle the ball for sure, but they're not true point guard types. And then you lose Jeremy Roach, which is significant because, again, like I don't think this roster has a true point guard. So if you're comparing Duke to the other probably top 5, top 7, top 10 teams, maybe that's their issue. Like I said, like losing TJ Power, Mark Mitchell, those are guys that are just seeking bigger roles at schools that'll offer them that. But I think Duke is worth a mention because I think the Roach loss is significant.
Yeah, so I actually do have Duke on my winners list. And I'll tell you why. I think that yes, the losses are very evident. Roach is the main one, but you also lost a ton of young talent, potential talent in Sean Stewart. You mentioned Power. You mentioned Mark Mitchell had been around for a while, but he was still not finding necessarily the role he wanted. So there's definitely you definitely lose talent, but Duke losing talent at the end of the bench is different than most other schools losing talent at the end of the bench because the people at the end of the bench were former five stars, right? Or former very highly ranked recruits that are going to gain a lot of attraction outside. And I think what Duke saw was a team in UConn that sort of needed to find a more well-rounded approach and maybe one star, right? And they have their star in Cooper Flag. And I think finding those pieces that will not necessarily want to be the number one option, but know how to play a role that makes sense for that team is really important. I think they did a really good job in finding those, whether that's Zion James coming in from Tulane or Mason Gillis, who has a ton of experience at Purdue, or even Malik Brown, who probably won't start or anything, but he'll be a nice bench piece coming off of Syracuse. And those all have been, well, James not at Tulane, but Gillis and Brown both played power conference minutes and a lot of them last year. And then as far as your concerns about the point guard, I hear you and I get it. I just have a little bit of faith in either Caleb Foster or Tyrese Proctor or some combination of them in the aggregate could get enough out of the point guard position. I think that's all you need, especially with such a star in Flag, or that we anticipate to be a star in Flag. And I think that's how the Blue Devils are playing it as well. So that's why I have them as one of my winners.
And you mentioned Duke losing guys off the end of the bench. Well, that transitions into one of my winners as well, Virginia, who is the major beneficiary of one of the Duke bench guys that transferred in, and that's TJ Power, who is really, I think, the make or break player for Virginia this year. And somebody who is athletic, somebody who could shoot the ball from the forward position, just adds a lot of elements that Virginia did not have in their front court last year and was a major issue. I mean, I guess you could say Jake Groves, but like this is a guy who's a lot more athletic. They added athleticism throughout their transfer portal acquisitions. Elijah Saunders and Jalen Warley, two guys that I think are of note. And then they needed a point guard, and they got that in Day Ames from Kansas State. So they added really a bunch of key role players to their roster, guys that I think could mesh together and make it a solid Virginia team, make it a team that was better than last year, because you were looking at their just atrocious tournament performance and then losing two guys to the NBA, Ryan Dunn, Reese Beekman. We were thinking this team could be even worse. And they add a lot of really prevalent power conference level, maybe even high level power conference level players. And all they really lose is Leon Bond. So there wasn't a mass exodus. They got some pieces that I think are more suited for what Tony Bennett might make into a somewhat modernized offense. I don't think they're going to all of a sudden be playing faster, but could they be 15th to last in pace instead of last in pace? I think that'll make a huge difference. And I think Virginia is absolutely a winner.
Yeah, I think they just missed my cut for just one reason in particular. I really do like the transfer class that UVA was able to bring in, but one thing I do worry about is the fact that at times Virginia struggled with a guy that could just take over the game. Like Reese Beekman was able to do it sometimes, but he wasn't able to do it all the times. And there was a few games where he ended up with like a stat line that looked like 6 for 17 or, 5 for 14 or something like that, where you needed some person to step up and be able to create offense for themselves. And that didn't necessarily always happen. And what I'm a little bit worried about is they don't have that guy in this transfer portal class either. It could be Ames, it could be Power, but we haven't seen it fully yet. I guess Ames is probably the best bet, but I don't know. I just want to see it on the court first. But I do really like the class overall. I just picked a couple of other ones that I think made a little bit more sense for a fuller team at this point.
All right. Well, take us away with one of those.
Yeah, I think we've been alluding to this team for a couple minutes now, but I think it's time to talk about Louisville and what Pat Kelsey has done coming in from the College of Charleston. Now, it's an entire an entire team flip. 13 outgoing transfers according to 247 Sports and 12 incoming transfers. And there were some pretty talented pieces, I would say, or about as talented as you can get from a team that struggled so much last year. I do think Brandon Huntley Hatfield is good. I do think Mike James is pretty good. I do think Trey White, even though he didn't have a great year, he was pretty good. He was pretty good at USC when he came in before. But like you said, with the max exodus for, I believe it was Florida State, sometimes it's good to clear house a little bit, right? And I think that Kelsey really brought in a lot of talented players, and I think he did a little bit better than people anticipated, given how that Louisville coaching search went, especially how it was late in the season and you didn't really know what to expect. But players like Terrence Edwards, Keyshawn Pryor, Chucky Hepburn, Noah Waterman, there's a lot of players that you look up and down, Javon Hadley, Corin Johnson, right? These are real, I think, pretty good players. Do they have a star? We're not sure yet. But for the situation they were in, I think Kelsey did a really good job forming a team that makes sense.
Yeah, that was an easy pick for me as well. Probably my biggest winner is Louisville. They're improving a lot in the roster department. Some people are picking them like top 5, top 4 in the ACC next year. I don't think it's really likely that they make that big of a jump considering the position that they were in, even with a much more competent coach and a much better roster. Ali Khalifa is another guy they're bringing in from BYU, 6'11", big. I think you didn't mention him, but yeah, Terrence Edwards, I think, is huge from James Madison, just was a star last year. And they won 30 games. They beat Wisconsin like in the tournament. And actually, they bring Hepburn with them.
I was going to say, now they're teammates, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, I think that's just a big roster overhaul for the better. We talked about some of them in the Big East, like DePaul. A big roster overhaul, but not going to be competitive in the Big East. This is different. Louisville will be competitive in the ACC. Another team that also had a big roster overhaul that I put in my winners category is SMU, who is coming in to the ACC. And of the 3 teams that are coming into the ACC, 2 of them are from another power conference in the Pac-12. One of them is SMU from the American. I fear SMU as a UVA fan, as a fan of a returning ACC team, more than I fear the 2 incoming Pac-12 schools by a pretty big margin, because they bring in a legitimate ACC roster in year 1. First-year head coach Andy Enfield basically said outright, I'm not taking this job if they didn't move to the ACC. And he turned what, in my opinion, an AAC roster into an ACC one as a result of this portal cycle. 10 transfers coming out, but the guys they bring in are just much better in all counts. I love Boopy Miller from Wake Forest. Just his handles are incredible. Really good guy to run the point. They got Matt Cross from UMass, a guy that could score. If he could provide a little bit of shooting, that would be huge, because he's a guy that could get to the rack and rebound. And then Jarrell Colbert from Kansas State, I think that's a guy that could break out. SMU is not necessarily going to finish top half of the ACC, but they're legitimately ready for the jump. I'm completely convinced, as a result of grabbing a real solid coach in Andy Enfield and then grabbing just talent out of the portal from power conference schools or high-performing mid-major players.
Yeah, you didn't even mention Cario Quendo, who comes in from Oregon but also played really well at Georgia, or Johan Traore coming in from UC Santa Barbara, but he was a former 5-star prospect who started at Auburn. So people really do like him as well. For me, I just struggled picking a team. I agree that he did a great job, and Enfield did a great job turning this SMU roster around and making it competitive. I just had a tough time picking a team to be a winner, which we only get 3, that I don't think is going to finish in the top half. I think there are teams that elevated. It's hard to go from good to great, and I think there are a couple of teams like Duke that elevated their players a little bit more. So for that reason, they left. I got them left off my list, but they were definitely in consideration as well. So we got one left for me. I have my final winner is out of Winston-Salem, and that's going to be the Wake Forest Demon Deacons. Now, they did lose players, right? There's no denying that. You just mentioned Boopy Miller, who went to SMU, so that's now an inter-conference transfer, I guess. But he went to SMU, and then Andrew Carr was the other big one. He went to Kentucky. I just think that they picked players that are going to fit really well with their returning core. So their returning core being, of course, Hunter Salas, who they had a big win by getting him back from the draft. They also have Efton Reed coming back, and then Kim Hildreth is seemingly still at Wake Forest. It feels like he's been there forever, but he has another year back as well. I really like the addition of Tyler Johnson coming in from Louisville. He can sort of play. He's young. He doesn't have as much experience as these past players, but he can sort of play the Tyree Appleby role or the Alondis Williams role, and he has a lot of years left. So if you're looking for a program building one, I think that's a really nice piece. I also really like the addition of Omaha Billieu from Iowa State. He's a former 5-star prospect who can take a big jump, and I think Wake Forest has a good enough roster and a good enough base for them to be able to take a flyer on a prospect like Billieu. So I like that pickup as well. And then finally, Trayvon Spillers. He's just a dirty power forward who can do all the work inside. He's big bodied. He'll have some production. He's not going to ever be the number one option, but I like that pickup from App State as well. I just think they did a really good job filling in holes that they might have had. I still worry a little bit about their front court depth, but other than that, I think Steve Forbes probably has his best overall team in his time at Wake Forest so far.
Yeah, I think one of the storylines with Wake Forest next year, probably the biggest one, is Steve Forbes has been great in the portal, right? And he, I think, did a great job this past cycle, but they will have not only the mix of that talent, right? Because they've had talent in the past. They had the year of Alondis Williams. They had the year of Tyree Appleby. Steve Forbes still has never made the tournament as the head coach of Wake Forest, but now they have the returning pieces. They have Reed back and they have Salas back. Like, that is going to be the first year that Steve Forbes has now 2 seasons to develop these guys. And that's why I think is a valid argument to make that Wake Forest is finally a legitimate tournament team. And it's going to be different than the previous years. So good call there. Those are all of my winners as well, but just a couple of honorable mentions. I think NC State adding Dontrez Styles, former Tar Heel, most recently a Georgetown Hoya, and then Brandon Huntley Hatfield from Louisville. 2 players from teams that did not do too well in the recent past, but will probably have more efficient numbers, playing a lesser role in their offense. And then Cal, year 2 under Mark Madsen, I think they improved a lot in terms of talent. So they were really close to winner for me. They got Stojakovic from Stanford, who we mentioned earlier, and then Madi Sissoko from Michigan State is a pretty good ad. So those are honorable mentions. Did you have anybody else you want to add?
No, I'm glad you mentioned Cal, though. They are a really interesting team to me. Just the improvement that Matchin showed after taking over from Mark Fox, who really was pretty dismal during his time at Cal, and then turning it around to be a below average team, right, in year 1. I'm pretty positive and optimistic about how that's going, and that the transfer portal tackle didn't change that this year. So I'm very happy to see that as well.
All right. Well, that will do it for today's edition of the CBB Review Studio podcast. Be sure to follow us on the socials and subscribe to our channel at CBB Review. We will be having more episodes on the rest of the transfer portal conferences. So we did the Big East and the ACC. We'll have the rest of the Power 5, and then we'll have potentially a mid-majors episode. But yeah, thanks for watching once again. Thanks for listening, and take care.